Real quick, I just wanted to point out that these are some thoughts on Beelzebub that I wrote down on my phone after I finished the series. I guess I just thought it'd be fun to read these out, because I have this little script, this handy dandy script typed, and I just left it alone to dust, and I just thought maybe it'd be fun to take a crack at it and see what it'd be like to read it. I don't know. And I just thought that if I have this Beelzebub review, basically, that maybe I should narrate it. It could be cool. Maybe not. Here we go. Beelzebub is one of the strangest shows I've ever seen. Maybe it's because in the past half year or so I've looked into how anime is created by watching several documentaries and reading up on whatever behind-the-scenes information I've been able to come across, but even without that knowledge, this show feels cheap. I don't mean that this anime is strange in tone and the aura it gives off, kind of like Soul Eater for example, but I mean in the way it's put together, it feels really cheap. Allow me to explain. Beelzebub is an adaptation of the Shonen Jump manga of the same name. The manga, which I haven't read. It's effectively a parody of multiple shonen tropes that are common in Shonen Jump thanks to series like Bleach and Dragon Ball, for example. The story features Tatsumi Oga, a delinquent famous for rampaging like an ogre. While beating up other thugs, one day an old man named Alan Delon floats down a river. When Oga punches Alan Delon, he splits open and a baby pops out. Thanks to a series of events that occur afterwards, Oga now has to take care of Baby Bill until he's old enough to destroy the world. What's actually going on is that the great demon lord sent his son to the human world to destroy it with his caretaker, the demon maidservant Hilda. Eventually other demons show up, and this leads to the tone either shifting from a comedy to drama or straight parody. It took me about 10 episodes to get into this show, and that's because I did have a lot of issues with it. Not as many as I had for Twin Star Exorcists, another show produced by Studio Pierrot, but just enough that I felt that typing out a review and editing together a video is necessary, I suppose. The plot is all over the place. Maybe it's because I never read the manga the show was adapted from, but the story can't really make up its mind on what it wants to be. From what I've read of Blood Lad, 2 double volumes, so 4 volumes, another comedy action series that felt a lot like Beelzebub did, it eased me into whatever action there was because the elements it introduced made it feel as though the series could go anywhere. In Blood Lad, the main female lead dies shortly after the series begins. It's a good example of the comedy in the series, as it's played for laughs, but it also shows us what repercussions this has on her life. At this point, 2 chapters in, it shows us that the series is able to use elements of comedy and drama to metaphorically bounce off each other to help drive the plot forwards. These elements are continued to be experimented on with the boxing match and the scenes in the jail. Maybe as I continue to read Blood Lad, it'll become a confusing mess, but I did feel it set up the tone it would have throughout the section I read very well. Beelzebub didn't get serious until around episode 18 or so when Baby Biel gets sick, and the fight with Toga happens. There were even some scenes in what I assumed to be filler episodes that sprinkled some serious-esque scenes that were never built upon later. If anything, these filler episodes can be used as examples of moments that expand upon Oga and Baby Biel's friendship. But after the main characters destroy their school setting by accident, they go to another school and effectively the same thing happens. There's some comedy, then there's some parts that are never built upon that I assume is filler, then there's a serious moment that has the tone go from a comedy to a drama with a strange tone. The serious moments in Beelzebub, in my opinion, aren't executed just right until the fight scene with the minions of Baby Biel's older brother. Even then, the scenes that are well executed are good at best. I almost want to say I'm almost a fan of Beelzebub's filler more than the actual story. But even then, I only really enjoyed the filler that was in the last core of the show. The only serious segment I felt Beelzebub did well was the I am the parent scene. It's probably the most well done in terms of setting the tone and establishing the mood of the characters. Also, it's one of the few moments of character development in the entire 60-episode show. I do enjoy this anime. The story isn't my favorite, the filler episodes aren't my favorite, but even though their motivations aren't clearly defined, I think this is a good example where the characters make the show. I'll touch on this later, but I think the animation in this show is lacking, save for all 5 of the openings and the first 4 endings. But in this case, I don't think it matters, because you might enjoy the characters enough that everything else that happens around them become vehicles for their involvement in a situation rather than developing from them. Like I said earlier, this show is a comedy, and I haven't seen too many comedies, but I was able to grasp the feel of this show pretty early on, and realized that not too many people took their situations seriously. This made the show feel like an even more episodic, not as well animated Fooly Cooly, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's just that when the series wants to become exactly what it's parodying, kind of like One Punch Man did, and from what I heard Sam and the Summoner did, is when the show feels like two different versions of the story actively clashing with each other instead of bouncing off of each other like in that section of Bloodlet I read. I felt the comedy in the show was fine, but one of the reasons I don't think it would connect with too many people is Baby Beal himself. The first slew of episodic segments of the show use Baby Beal electrocuting people when crying is the punchline. This is actually something that annoyed me when I started watching the series, but over time, those moments of annoyance became less and less prevalent. Maybe it's because he cried less, but I ended up finding it actually really funny after a while. I think when the show is more experimental with its visual gags and settings is when the show's comedy was the strongest. This is one of the reasons why the last core was actually my favorite segment of the show. It felt creative. It felt like it took the setup and was really experimental with what they could do. Maybe their definition of experimental could boil down to introducing another character, or having Baby Beal grow to be huge, but this is when I felt the show was at its strongest. Also, yeah, even the more serious moments I felt were better than usual during this segment of the show. It's probably because I could see the influence the characters were having on each other. I've read 7 volumes of Gintama, which in my opinion is a much better comedy series with, from what I can tell, serious elements being set up concerning everyone's past, but having the characters influence other characters and seeing them if not grow, then at least change as people is something I feel is important, even in a series like Gintama. Of course, you have to make sure this character progression makes sense. There are comedies I feel mess this up. This is why I think ABC comedies like Suburgatory had a bad second half of their second season, and why the third season of that show is horrible, and why I feel Blackish dropped the ball way more in its third season than it really should have. What I meant to say with all of this is that Beelzebub didn't apply this kind of character to their characters until well into the second half of the show. While this isn't horrible, I feel it makes the show feel lopsided, in tone and in execution. You don't have to have the deepest characters ever for them to be enjoyable. But if they're going to change over the course of the story, I'd prefer if their characterization didn't shift from place to place. Oga, for example, wants to get rid of Baby Beal. Then around episode 48, he finally accepts being his parent when he fights against the minions of Baby Beal's older brother. Then afterwards, he jokes about getting rid of Baby Beal again. It obviously wasn't a joke that was meant to be taken very seriously, but is Oga really gonna pretend that everything he's been through up to this point was worth getting rid of Baby Beal over? I guess so, that's his character. Again, I don't know if this is because I don't know too many comedies, but I guess I just felt that some characters weren't fleshed out correctly. But then again, I'm not the author of this series, so I haven't thought about whatever hypothetical situation the characters could get into and how they'd react like this man has. I found the characters enjoyable regardless. So getting back as to why I feel this show comes off as cheap. As I said earlier, I felt the animation in the show was lacking, but unlike everything else about the show that I've been able to put into words, I can't quite pinpoint why I feel this way. Maybe it's because the director of the show, Norihiro Takamoto, hasn't done much outside of the early 2000s. After looking at some clips of some other shows he's done, his style feels pretty, for lack of a better word, limited. I know the go-to example as to how an artistic and stylistic use of limited animation can be applied to a show in order to make it great is one of my all-time favorite directors, Hiroyuki Imaishi. But unlike Imaishi's trademark flow and energy, Takamoto's feels way more stilted. I feel like he's way better at directing talking scenes, as strange as that sounds. Yes, talking scenes can be engaging in a directorial sense, even in shows with not much going on in them animation-wise. When these characters are able to breathe and be characters, chatting it up with each other, delivering the odd punchline here and there, I think it works. When the show tries to be serious early on in the fights, like in episode 18, it's borderline pathetic. The only thing that saves it are the return to the comedic elements. This stilted style is also meant to be taken seriously later on when the gang plays a game of volleyball, which, combined with the story that I feel is all over the place, results in one of the strangest executed sequences I've ever seen put to animation. Sometimes the tone is comedic. Sometimes I'm suddenly supposed to be worried for the characters when they get hurt. Sometimes the animation and bizarre soundtrack give off a humorous vibe, but then something dramatic happens and flips the entire sequence on its head. It gets to the point where for about 2 episodes I was just left scratching my head wondering what the hell is going on in this show. I'm not saying this to be funny either. The plot in this part of the show starts with the gang needing to win a game of volleyball so they aren't expelled from school. By the time it ends, it becomes a fight against thugs on a volleyball court, while 2 of the characters sort out their personal problems toward each other regarding their mysterious middle school pasts. Also, demon powers, and the question of whether or not other characters know about them is hanging over Oga's head the entire time. By the way, I know some might inquire that it's a comedy, so it doesn't need to have good animation. You're right, some comedy works because of the lack of animation. But I think my main problem with Beelzebub's animation isn't that it could have been better, it's that for what was showcased, it could have been more appealing to just watch than it was. Some of it just feels too stilted and uncreative to get properly invested in. Another reason why I feel the talking scenes were the best directed, because I felt the comedic tone wasn't lost during the whole thing. Overall, this show was a mixed bag. I'm not sure if I'd recommend it to anyone as a comedy anime, but then again, comedy shows aren't my forte, so maybe something was just lost on me. If you're curious, I'd go ahead and give the show a watch. To give a weird example as to how mixed I felt the show was, my feelings toward the openings and endings wouldn't be too bad, I guess. The first opening sequence was catchy, but not in a good way, in more of an annoying way. It's passable with the song and animation. The second opening is more of the same, but the song I feel is way better. The third opening sounds cool, and the animation is good, but it doesn't correctly fit the tone of the show too well, I feel. The fourth opening I feel captures the tone of the show way more. Even though the second opening is my favorite, the fourth opening is probably the best one the show has to offer. The song and animation represent the show like a glove, and even with some odd choices, specifically when characters are appearing to be falling from the sky, but then are posed in any fashion they want to be by the time the cut is done, the fifth opening is catchy but feels the most basic. Though I would be lying if I didn't say it represented how far the characters have come compared to the beginning of their long, stupid journey. The endings? God, where do I start? Each ending feels basic, but as time goes on they become more stylistic. The first ending is the most basic. The second and third have the best animation in the entire show, and the songs fit the sequences, but not necessarily the show. The fourth doesn't work with the show's more, for the most part, dramatic tone, but is really cute with both the visuals and the music. The fifth ending is back to basics, just showing characters doing things. I don't know, man. Beelzebub's one of the strangest shows I've ever watched. Go watch it if you want, but don't take it too seriously. Don't even take the dramatic moments seriously. You'll probably have more fun that way.